What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are going to be talking about some brand new datasheets and stratagems and enhancements that were just spoiled on the Games Workshop Twitch channel. These were revealed at the Kansas City Open, where Games Workshop is going to be playing both tonight, Thursday, and Friday night some show matches for Warhammer 40k 10th edition, showcasing some armies, datasheets, new units, and interactions from the new edition of the game. The Thursday night event showcased Chaos Demons and Death Guard, and we got a very good look at how these armies are going to operate in the new edition. I have videos on the faction focus articles for both Chaos Demons and Death Guard over on the channel, so if you want a summary of the stuff we've already seen for these factions, you can go check those out over there. That's going to give you a lot of background information for understanding the mechanics that we're talking about in this video. This case, I'm just going to be talking about new stuff that we haven't seen before, and in every case, I'm going to talk about the datasheet that was revealed, and then any attachments to that datasheet or enhancements to those characters that were used on stream to interact with it specifically. Then we'll have some stratagems for each faction. They also revealed some mission mechanics as well that I will be talking about in a future video, so stay tuned for that a little bit later on today. Starting with Death Guard, we got a ton of exciting reveals for this faction, and I know their reception by the community has been very mixed, but I think they showcased some very interesting mechanics and some relatively strong abilities. It definitely doesn't seem like Death Guard are dead on arrival in this new edition, and they certainly held their own in this game. Demons did end up winning the game, but it was extremely close, and it kind of felt like the Death Guard player maybe played a little too aggressively. We'll start with the basics, the Death Guard Rhino. This is a normal Rhino profile. It basically has all the statistics that we would expect from it. A 12-inch movement, toughness 9, a 3+ save, 10 wounds, a 6+ leadership, and an OC value of 2. It has the Deadly Demise D3 and Firing Deck 2 rolls that we've seen on other Rhinos. However, it also gets the Nurgle's Gift ability, so it does project your anti-toughness auras. Like other Rhinos, it has the self-repair ability, and it's able to take combi weapons, Havoc Launchers, or Plague combi bolters. We see on the flip side of the datasheet that the Havoc Launcher can be taken in addition to the Pintle-mounted weapon. That's either the combi weapon or the Plague Bolter. The Plague Bolter comes with that lethal hits and rapid fire 2 that we would expect. Basically, we've seen this on the Blight Lord Terminator datasheet, and that lethal hits does make the 4 shots from this thing relatively useful. Apart from that, it's able to transport up to 12 Death Guard infantry, not Terminators, Cultists, or Poxwalker models, unfortunately. Generally speaking, this is going to be including a big brick of Plague Marines, most likely, with 2 attached characters. It definitely seems like one of the Death Guard's main tactics is going to be forcing characters into their infantry units, like the Malignant Plaguecaster that we've seen before, and using these transports to get them up the table into relevant positions before threatening your opponent. So putting 2 to 3 characters into a Plague Marine unit is probably going to be pretty common. Speaking of Plague Marines, we also see the datasheet for them. These guys have basically what is to be expected for the bubonic Astartes core profile, a relatively slow 5-inch movement, but high toughness of 5, 3+ save with 2 wounds, a 6+ leadership, and OC value of 2. They also have the faction ability Nurgle's Gift and the Remorseless special rule. This gives them +1 to battle shock tests while within range of an objective. So they effectively go from leadership 6 down to leadership 5, making them very sticky to knock off objectives with battle shock effects. They have a huge variety of weapons they can equip, but many of them we have seen before, including the Blight Launcher, Melt-A-Gun, Plasma Pistol, Plague Bolt Gun, Bolt Pistol. They can take a Plague Belcher, an anti-infantry 4+, D6 shot weapon with a 12-inch range at strength 4, AP 1, 1 damage, but fires with Torrent and ignores cover. Overall, pretty decent profile for a Flamer equivalent. Alternatively, they can take the Plague Spewer, which is much heavier, is Strength 5, AP 1, and Anti-Infantry 2+, but otherwise has the same profile. In melee, these guys slap pretty hard. The base weapon is their Plague Knives, which are 3 attack weapons, hitting on 3s at Strength 4, AP 0 for 1 damage, but lethal hits. In fact, all of their melee weapons and most of their ranged weapons have that lethal hit characteristic, being Plague weapons. Their Power Sword equivalent, the Bubonic weapon, is 4 attacks, hitting on 3s at Strength 5, AP 2 for 1 damage, and the lucky models in the unit who can take a heavy Plague weapon, swing with 3 attacks, hitting on 4s at Strength 8, AP 2, 2 damage. It's important to remember that every time these guys are going to be fighting in melee, they're going to be reducing your toughness by 1 thanks to that Nurgle's Gift aura. So the strength values feel relatively low, or at least kind of samey as all Space Marine chapters, but they are, in a lot of situations, going to be +1 to wound against most targets. Now, inside these guys, we have a bunch of characters that can be attached to the unit. We've already seen the Malignant Plaguecaster that can throw its Flamer out and slow down enemies, but you can also include a Foul Blightspawn to give them penalties in melee. The Foul Blightspawn retains a lot of its same abilities that it had previously. It has a Plague Sprayer, a 12-inch range D6 shot, strength 7, AP2, 2 damage ranged weapon that is anti-infantry, 2+, ignores cover, and has the torrent effect. It is a normal close combat weapon with 4 attacks in melee, has the leader ability that allows it to attach to Plague Marines, and has the rider that you can attach multiple leaders to a Plague Marine unit. The only restriction being that you can't attach multiple of the same leader. So we can't take 2 Foul Blightspawn to fuel out as many Flamers as we want, but you can take the Foul Blightspawn in addition to a Lord or a Malignant Plaguecaster. The big benefit that you get for attaching a Foul Blightspawn to a unit is its putrefying stink. Foul Blightspawn used to affect your ability to fight in the fight phase, and they continue to do that in 10th edition by making their unit always fights first. This gives them the ability to swing before an enemy charging unit, and while Plague Marines aren't the most devastating fighters in the game, they are deadly enough, especially with some other buffs floating around, that they're going to be able to put a dent into any unit that's coming into them, especially if they have a couple of those heavy plague weapons. Not to mention the fact that if you are kitting out Flamers, which I generally speaking think is going to be the way that we're going to see Death Guard be built out, you have a devastating Overwatch, and you're probably going to do some damage to that unit on the way in anyway, especially if you have some Plague Sprayers around. Otherwise, this guy has a 5-inch movement, toughness of 5, 3+ save, 4 wounds, a 6+ leadership, and an objective control value of 1. Now, we saw a lot of datasheets spoiled in the Death Guard faction article, and one that we had a little bit of a look at was the Plagueburst Crawler. The Plagueburst Crawler has been fully revealed as of this live stream, and we have more than just its weapons to go by. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any other special abilities to speak of. It just has the spore-laced shockwaves that we've seen previously, forcing enemies hit by its Plagueburst mortar to take battle shock tests, but that is a very useful ability, allowing it to potentially prevent enemies from holding their backline objectives just by tagging them with Plagueburst Crawler shots. As a reminder, that Plagueburst Mortar is a blast anti-infantry weapon with the lethal hits ability, firing at a 48-inch range for D6 + 3 attacks, that blast most likely increasing that to D6 + 4 or 5, depending on the size of the unit you're shooting at, hitting on 3s, maybe 4s if you're firing indirectly, at strength 8, AP1 for 2 damage. In addition, it can mount either Plague Spitters or Entropy Cannons on its sides. The Entropy Cannons are 24-inch range, one-shot lethal hitting weapons, hitting on 3s at strength 10 AP3 for D6 + 1 damage, a relatively short range but punchy last cannon profile. The Plague Spitters are pretty impressive. They do have a 12-inch range, but basically get all of that Plague Flamer mechanics. They're anti-infantry 2+, ignore cover, have torrent, and fire D6 shots each, and you mount 2 of them, so you're going to be firing 2d6 at least, at strength 6, AP1 for 2 damage. You can also take either a Heavy Slugger, a 4-shot, strength 5 AP1, 1 damage weapon with a 36-inch range, or a Rodhail Volley Gun, a 3-shot Rapid Fire 3, 24-inch range weapon, so it's firing 3 shots out to 24 inches, or 6 shots out to 12 with the lethal hits characteristic at strength 5, AP0 for 1 damage. In melee, it has the normal armored tracks profile that we've seen on the Rhino, 3 attacks hitting on 4s at strength 6, AP0 for 1 damage. Its base profile is pretty tanky. It has movement and toughness 10, a 2+ base save, 12 wounds, a leadership value of 6, and an impressive OC value of 4. That toughness of 10 and 2+ save is going to make this thing tough to kill, because you can get cover very easily in 10th edition. All you have to do is hide a portion of your unit behind a ruin, and suddenly that 2+ save goes to a 1+ save. And at toughness 10, most anti-tank weapons in the game are going to be wounding us on 4s or 5s, unless they're the las cannon equivalent. Even if they're a high enough AP value to get through a 1+ armor save, it has a 5+ invulnerable save baked in. So it's relatively difficult to punch through for most anti-tank weapons, despite the fact that it's missing the -1 damage it got from the 9th edition codex. Now, another unit we saw in the faction reveal article were Blight Lord Terminators, and these were played in the showcase game, but what we didn't see was an attachment for them, and in that showcase game we also get the full datasheet for the Lord of Virulence, and this guy slaps real hard. The Lord of Virulence is a move 4 T6, 2+ save, 6 wound, 6+ leadership, 1 objective control leader character with the deep strike ability allowing him to enter a Terminator unit and jump in alongside them. He has a twin Plague Spewer, an anti-infantry 2+ ignore cover torrent flamer at basically the profile we've seen before, 12-inch range for d6 shots at strength 5, AP 1 for 1 damage, but that twin-linked profile makes it incredibly effective. He also has a heavy Plague Fist, swinging 5 times, hitting on 3s, also with the lethal hits ability at strength 8, AP 2, 2 damage. Not a shocking melee profile, but nothing to shake a stick at. To be fair though, you are not really taking him for his melee prowess, instead you're taking him for his special abilities. The big one is the Master of Destruction special ability. This gives the unit he is leading full wound rerolls for all ranged attacks. Importantly, this is not melee attacks, so if you see this guy in a unit, you can't reroll your melee wound rolls with him. I think they did this on stream, which is technically not correct. It is only your guns. But that said, a big unit of Blightlord Terminators with a bunch of guns in it, a bunch of flamethrowers, a bunch of blast weapons is going to be absolutely devastating with a Lord of Virulence attached. In addition, he has the Blight Bombardment ability. This gives +1 to hit and ignore cover to any blast weapons targeting units visible to his model. Importantly, that is any model in the army, including Plagueburst Crawlers, Blight Launcher carriers elsewhere on the table, and it doesn't have a range. It simply requires that the Lord of Virulence sees the target. So if you're firing those Plagueburst Crawlers directly, they're going to be hitting on 2s and ignoring cover with that relatively low AP value. So if your opponent deploys out in the open and you have started your Lord of Virulence on the table, or you just deep strike him behind your enemy line so he can see their whole army, his Blight Bombardment is going to get you a ton of value. This guy is the sauce that we needed to see these Blightlord Terminators do some insane work, and the fact that he buffs all of your other blast weapons is just gravy. The downside for him, I think, is that he can only be assigned to Blightlord Terminators and Death Shroud Terminators. You cannot put him in big bricks of Plague Marines, for example. Assuming that Death Shroud Terminators retain a solid profile on their Gauntlet Flamers, I do think that a Lord of Virulence attached to a Death Shroud Terminator unit is going to be absolutely a nightmare. Because this guy gives you full wound rerolls anytime you fire any of those ranged weapons, and you don't have to worry about those guys hitting with their attacks, they're going to rinse down a lot of enemies almost regardless of what their toughness value is. Especially given how powerful torrent weapons are in Overwatch, the fact that this guy has a powerful flamer by himself, and on top of that can also buff an entire unit full of flamer-equipped Terminators, makes the idea of that whole combo incredibly scary. Now, I said I would spoil some enhancements for you, and we did get one of them from the Death Guard Codex. This is the Shamblerot ability. And this one's worded very strangely. It is an enhancement, so it is granted to the unit before the game starts, and it makes all enemies targeting the bearer's unit -2 to charge rolls. This is a very Death Guard ability. It makes it just super tough for your opponent to come into you. You can even, potentially be overwatching them, have them fail a charge, and then sit there anyway and just wait for your Death Shroud Terminators to charge them and kill them. It's very good. The reason it's worded super weirdly is because it turns on when they're selected as the target of a charge and then lasts through the rest of the phase. Why it does that, I don't know. You could just say, subtract 2 to charge rolls targeting this unit, but I don't know. Now, last but certainly not least, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the big man himself. Mortarion was also on the field for this stream. This guy comes in at a relatively impressive top-line profile, only a 10-inch movement, but we have seen a movement reduction across the board on these big units. I think most of the move 12 plus have been reduced a little bit if they aren't specifically transports. A very impressive toughness value of 12, meaning that all but the heaviest anti-tank weapons are going to be winning him on 5s. Another impressive armor save value of 2 plus. And again, I can't stress this enough. This guy benefits from cover now. If he's wholly within a terrain feature or partially obscured by a terrain feature, especially a ruin, he will get cover, improving him to a 1+ save. That's a big deal. He can also give himself cover on a stick, as we will talk about in a moment, so he just has it all the time, basically. He has 16 wounds, but he does have the Feel No Pain 5+ ability, so those 16 wounds are going to go pretty far. He doesn't have any damage reduction like he did previously, but he is going to be saving a lot of his damage. He has a good leadership value of 5+ and a strong objective control value of 6. Now, Mortarion has taken a pretty big hit on his offensive profile. Unfortunately for the big guy, he's not quite the same level of destruction that we saw him in the past. His Rot Wind is his psychic attack. It fires an 18-inch range for d6 plus 3 shots. It is fortunately not hazardous for him. It does, however, blast and have devastating wounds and lethal hits abilities, so automatically wounding on its hit rolls of 6, and its wound rolls of 6 automatically turn into mortal wounds. He has his pistol as well, the Lantern, that he can fire in melee. Unfortunately, he can't fire his Rotwind in melee, but he can shoot it out of melee because he is a monster, so he can target enemies that he's not engaged with. Importantly, though, being a monster, and some people had to remind me of this, he can shoot his pistol and fling his psychic power at the same time, since monsters and vehicles with big guns never tire are able to fire both types of weapons, unlike foot troops. Like all beam weapons, the Lantern now has the Sustained Hits D3 ability, allowing it to potentially triple its hits if it rolls a critical hit roll on a 6. It shoots one time at 18-inch range, hitting on a 2 for Strength 9, AP 3, 3 damage. Definitely not the most impressive profile in the world, but there is going to be that situation where you roll the 6, roll the 3, and shoot a tank for 12, and your opponent cries themselves to sleep. In melee, he can swing his big Scythe Silence, either on a sweep or strike profile. The strike profile attacks 5 times, hitting on 2s, at strength 14, AP 3, 4 damage. The sweep profile attacks 15 times, hitting on 2s again, at strength 7, AP 1, but only 1 damage. Now, Mortarion is reasonably impressive in melee, and he has some okay ranged attacks, but really what you're taking him for are his support abilities. First off, he has Host of Plagues, which is one of the modal effects we've seen most of the Primarchs get. He can either choose to have Miasma of Pestilence, which gives all friendly Death Guard units within 6 inches, including himself, cover against ranged attacks. Pretty good, full stop. That's a good one to start the game off with if your opponent is shooting at you. Since it affects everything, doesn't care about whether it's infantry, vehicles, a big titan, I guess if it's Death Guard keyworded. Are there any of those? I don't know. He can also choose Diseased Influence, which gives reroll wound rolls of 1 with all of your attacks. Good for both ranged and melee attacks, but to be honest, I would kind of rather this be a hit reroll because you want to trigger lethal hits as often as you can. Rerolling wounds is nice to have, but it's not quite as impactful as rerolling your hits, since you can convert into a wound roll and you have the opportunity to roll a 6 and convert into an automatic wound. Toxic Presence is the last one and increases the contagion range of all Death Guard units within 12 by 3 inches. I have a sneaking suspicion this is going to matter for a lot of other interactive effects that the faction has. This is chosen at the start of the battle round, so generally speaking, I think first battle round you're going to be choosing Miasma of Pestilence basically every time in order to take the Alpha Strike, or set yourself up in the middle of the table and be very resilient against ranged attacks. Diseased Influence then, once he gets stuck in, to help himself and his other buddies do more damage. Now, the other ability he has is a huge one, and we already talked about how strong a character like Trajan Valoris is for supporting the unit he's attached to, but Mortarion does that to an extra extent. He has the Lord of the Death Guard, which gives all Death Guard units within 6 inches the ability to ignore any modifiers to their characteristics, to any rolls they make, or tests made for it, excluding saving throws. So you still get affected by enemy AP characteristics, but things like charge modifiers, battle shock chest modifiers, any of that stuff is entirely ignored passively by Mortarion and basically his whole army. So while we see the ability for Death Guard to ignore movement modifiers that they had previously be removed, it's basically returned in Mortarion's ability, but it also has the extended effect that it affects all of your other abilities. So even if your opponent has stealth, even if they are imposing wound penalties on you, even if they are reducing your charge rolls with disruptive effects, Mortarion says no to all of that for a huge swath of the battlefield. Mortarion's definitely taken a hit from his last edition, but given the fact that the game looks like it's going to be significantly less lethal than it was, I don't know if Mortarion needed quite the same level of survivability that he did in 9th edition. The fact that he hits less hard is a little bit sad. He does feel a little bit pillow-fisted for a Primarch of Chaos, but on the flip side, his support abilities are good. The other big benefit that we see here is that despite the fact that he has 16 wounds, he is not towering. So he can hide behind ruins and their obscuring effect. So unlike in 9th edition where we were anticipating Mortarion having to play aggressively and having to run up the table to get value before he's killed by gun lines, this Mortarion can in fact stand behind the footprint of a ruin, hopefully in a position where he can move around the edge relatively quickly and be immune to your opponent's shooting for the majority of the game. So he can actually function as a support piece, unlike the current incarnation of Mortarion. And I can't really overstate how important that is for these big hybrid support and melee characters. Now with that, we do have one additional spoiler to give you. This is a stratagem for the Death Guard Plague Company detachment, and it is the return of Disgustingly Resilient, but with a lot of caveats. It is a relatively clunky stratagem. It's a 2 CP stratagem used in any fight phase after an enemy unit has selected one of your Death Guard units as the target of an attack. Until the end of the phase, you subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of attacks targeting that unit. Now, here's an important caveat here, and this could get errated, so a little bit of an asterisk. This doesn't say to a minimum of 1, and there are no core rules governing the modification of characteristics, as I spoke about in my video yesterday. So, you can reduce 1 damage attacks to 0 damage, which, if I were to prognosticate a little bit, would be why this is a 2 CP stratagem. That feels like a lot of command points for an army that wants to absorb charges and be as difficult to kill as possible, but the fact that you can take high volume 1 damage attacks and turn them to 0 damage attacks is insanely powerful. Now, it does cost you 2 CP, and as far as we know, there may be some ways to regenerate CP, but we're not 100% sure. Tallymen might do it, who knows? But right now, it looks like Death Guard are going to be kind of CP starved. So this is a big spend. I mean, it's 20% of the command points you're going to get for the entirety of the game. That said, if your opponent has to play around with this effect for the whole game, and the fact that you can basically blank one of their incoming melee attacks, especially when they're having to deal with things like Overwatch from rerolling Flamers and Foul Blightspawn making their units fight first, this is tough. It really depends on what the damage value of the enemy army is, but if they are a majority 1 damage melee army, there's basically no way that they fight through this. That said, that could be a typo. They could have just forgotten to write it down, or we could get a clarification on characteristic modification in the future that could make this not affect 1 damage attacks. But we don't have that yet, so we're just guessing. And with that, we will move into the other faction in the video today. This one is Chaos Demons, and we got a ton of spoilers for these guys. And let me tell you, Chaos Demons looking incredibly strong in 10th edition. We'll start with some of the lighter units that were used in the game. The Flesh Hounds are the first one. They are a fast utility unit. Unfortunately, have lost a lot of their damage output from the previous edition, but they seem pretty useful. They're move 12, toughness 4, a poor leadership of 7, but we should remember that they will most likely get +1 for being in the Shadow of Chaos, at least in the early game, 2 wounds apiece, and 1 objective control. They have a bad saving throw characteristic. They can go to a 6+ save when they're in cover, but that doesn't really matter because they will have a 5+ invulnerable save. In addition, they get a 3+ feel no pain against psychic attacks, which makes them hilariously resilient in matchups like Grey Knights, where most of your opponent's army have psychic weapons, and especially psychic weapons in melee. These guys are just shrugging wounds from those kinds of weapons most of the time. One thing to keep in mind about these guys is that they aren't quite as good as protecting your army from psychic attacks as they were previously. You can't just ram them down your opponent's face and hope that your 3+ denies prevented them from casting their psychic powers, because their psychic powers are just going to target whatever they want, and they'll shoot something that isn't the Flesh Hound if they have the opportunity to, so that they can bypass your 3+ damage ignore. The unit leader has a Burning Roar, a regular Flamer profile, strength 4, AP 0 for 1 damage, D6 shots with a 12-inch range, ignoring cover and torrent, and in melee they fight with Gore-Drenched Fangs, 3 attacks each, hitting on 3s at strength 5, AP 1, 1 damage. Unfortunately, not a particularly impressive profile, but it is a fast unit, and it feels like having small, fast units are going to be pretty useful in this new edition. They also have the ability to use the Heroic Intervention stratagem for 0 command points, even if your has already used it. While they are only objective control 1, the fact that they can countercharge units trying to contest their objectives means that they're just very good objective holders. I think that's going to be their primary use case. They're fast, they're going to run out, grab secondaries, contest objectives, and if your opponent tries to take them back from you, you charge them in their turn and kill them. We see a very similar unit over in the Tzeentch sub-faction. These are the Screamers. They are a 14-inch move, T4, 6+ save, which can go to a 5+ in cover, which really doesn't usually matter. Pretty hefty 3 wounds apiece at a poor leadership value of 7 and 1 objective control. They swing with the Lamprey Bite, attacking 3 times in melee, hitting on 4s at strength 6, AP 2 for 2 damage, and they have a Slashing Dive. In your movement phase, after they end a move, you can bomb 1 unit you go over. You roll a d6 for each model in the Screamer unit, and on a 4+, the enemy suffers 1 mortal wound. This is a basically classic ability for Screamers. They've had this in like every edition that I can remember, and that's mostly where a lot of their damage comes from. They're okay in melee, especially now that they have a baked-in 4+ invulnerable save. They're not having to rely on their 3+/6+ demonic invulnerability, which made them very easy to kill in melee, kind of idiosyncratically for a unit that was trying to get into melee. But on the other hand, only hitting on 4s makes them not so good at fighting. Again, a fast utility unit. They can do some mortal wounds, which is nice. They can deep strike as well, like all Chaos Demons, and that makes them good at scoring objectives. Now, those out of the way, we can get into some of the more interesting minions of Chaos, starting with the Flamers. These guys have gotten a big profile nerf from 9th edition, but if you have ever been shot at by a Flamer, you'll probably agree that that's probably for the best. The Flamers now are a 9-inch move model at toughness 4 with a 7+ save, which probably won't matter, 3 wounds, a 7+ leadership, and 1 objective control. They have the Bounding Leap ability, which allows them to shoot and fall back in the same turn, and they have the Fly keyword. While Fly is significantly worse at moving around terrain, it still allows you to move over models, and it prevents you from having to take desperate escape checks for moving out of melee, which actually means that these guys are going to be very difficult to pin down. They have a pretty decent number of attacks in melee, 3 attacks each, hitting on 4s at strength 4, so if you engage them, you don't even prevent them from shooting, get punched a bunch of times by their Flamer mouths, and then they fall back and Flamer you with their Flickering Flames. Flickering Flames are now a basically normal Flamer profile, d6 shots at strength 4, AP 1 for 1 damage, ignoring cover and torrenting to automatically hit, but they also have the Psychic keyword. Interestingly though, the Flamers don't have the Psyker keyword themselves, so while they are affected by enemy anti-Psyker defensive technology, they don't get rinsed down by offensive technology. We just saw in the Agents of the Imperium, Inquisitor Greyfax can absolutely dominate Psykers, and Black Templars can even flex into being very strong against them. And Flamers, while they do inflict psychic damage, don't actually suffer any of those penalties. The Flamers can attach an Exalted Flamer, the classic Flamer character who buffs nearby Flamers. In this case, this guy is a 9-inch move, T4, 6 wound, 7+ leadership, OC 1 leader character. You're bringing him for the Blazing Warpfire ability, which grants the Assault keyword to all models in the unit that the Flamer is leading. It's going to take a little bit of getting used to the fact that these ranged weapons are no longer assault weapons. Any torrent weapons that you remember advancing and shooting and not caring about the hit penalty for assault, you can't do that anymore unless they have the Assault keyword, and the Exalted Flamer gives that to the unit he's attached to. In addition, he has the Flames of Change ability. This allows him to set non-monster and vehicle enemies that he hits on fire. If he does so on a 4+, they subtract 2 from their move characteristic and advance and charge rolls. A little bit of a nice disruptive effect. In melee, he attacks 4 times, hitting on 4s at strength 5. However, the headliner is, of course, his ranged weapons, and this guy absolutely slaps. He can fire his flamethrowers with Pink Fire, a normal Psychic Flamer profile, ignoring cover and torrenting to auto-hit at a 12-inch range for 2d6 strength 5 AP 1 shots. Or he can soup them up and fire Blue Fire. This weapon also ignores cover and is psychic, but has a much more impressive profile. At an 18-inch range, 3 attacks, hitting on 3s at strength 9 AP 3 damage. I think this is really the reason you're taking this guy. This weapon is awesome, and there are even some ways to improve it. Now, before we move on to the big headliners of the Demon Showcase here, we'll talk about the Plaguebearers. This is a battle line demon unit, and these guys seem incredibly useful. They have a pretty tepid profile, movement 5 at T5, a bad saving throw characteristic, 2 wounds, a mediocre 7+ leadership, and an OC value of 2. However, that objective control is improved by the Infected Outbreak ability, which basically gives them the objective secured ability, where if they hold an objective in your command phase, then you hold it permanently until your opponent comes and takes it at the end of a turn. They can also equip a demonic icon, giving them a 6+ leadership, and an instrument of chaos, giving them +1 to their charge rolls. Both of these seem pretty useful. They have a 5+ invulnerable save, and in melee, attack 2 times with a Plague Sword, a lethal hitting melee weapon hitting on 3s at strength 4 and AP 1 for 1 damage. This is basically an identical profile to their previous edition's melee attack. They lost 1 point of AP, which most of the game did, but they gained a point of weapon skill, so mostly a side grade. Now overall, this unit feels not not very exciting, but they do seem incredibly useful. One thing that demons had a problem with was model count in the previous edition. Well, they always talk about teaming hordes of demons. Everyone's excited about taking the greater demons in Be'lakor, so they spend a lot of points on big, huge, flashy models, and holding their backline objectives can be tough, and the Plaguebearers just solve that problem. One unit of Plaguebearers strung across a couple of objectives at the beginning of the game means that you lock in those objectives and don't have to worry about them anymore unless your opponent can teleport. If you're doing enough damage with your greater demons, your opponent won't have enough beef to actually kill them. Speaking of beef, we can also improve the unit with the Spoilpox Scrivener. He can sneeze on you, a torrent pistol weapon, at only a 6-inch range for D6 attacks at strength 3, AP 0, 1 damage. Not that exciting, but very cute. And he can attack a bunch of times with basically a Plague Sword equivalent. He's just essentially 3 Plaguebearers stapled together. His top line profile is kind of mediocre. He moves 5 inches, a T5, 5 wounds with a 6+ leadership, and an OC value of 1. He can attach into Plaguebearer units and does improve their leadership value, but the real benefit are his abilities. The first one is Keep Counting, which gives you sustained hits 1 on your melee attacks, improving their Plague Sword attacks a little bit. The other one is Meet Your Quota, which improves their objective control characteristic by 1, making that entire unit objective control 3. And with the ability to lock in objectives and hold them permanently, an OC3 unit is able to put 32 objective control value worth of models on an objective and hold it basically indefinitely until you kill them. Again, while it's not that exciting, the Spoilpox Scrivener and the attached Plaguebearer unit do seem incredibly useful. Now let's move on to some more exciting profiles. We've already seen Be'lakor and the Keeper of Secrets, which were used in this game, but what we didn't see were the Lord of Change and Bloodthirster profiles. The Lord of Change is a ranged support character who can buff a Tzeentchian gun line to an absolutely extreme level, and himself is an absolute monster when it comes to ranged attacks. It's a move 12 flying monster coming in at an impressive toughness of 10, poor saving throw characteristic, but 18 wounds, a 6+ leadership, objective control value of 5, with a 4+ invulnerable save. It does have the Deadly Demise D6 ability, so it is an impressive explosion if you ever kill this guy, and he comes in with some pretty useful abilities. We'll talk about his ranged weapons first. He can equip a Rod of Sorcery, firing 6 shots, hitting on 2s at strength 8, AP 1, D3 damage. Already off to a pretty good start. On top of that, we can also fire a Bolt of Change, a psychic power that can be improved by choosing the focused version, getting the hazardous weapon ability. Either way, they're firing 18 inches with 9 attacks at 2+ ballistic skill and strength 9. The basic version is AP 1 for 1 damage. The focused version is AP 2 for D3 damage. Now, on top of that, these are also buffed by the Lord of Change's passive abilities. The Demon Lord of Tzeentch improves the strength characteristic of all ranged attacks made by Tzeentch demon units within 6 inches, including himself, by 1, meaning his Rod of Sorcery fires at strength 9 and his Bolt of Change fires at strength 10. His Master of Magic's ability allows him to choose either Ignore Cover, Lethal Hits, or Sustain D3 on his Bolt of Change every time he goes to shoot. Sustain D3 probably means he averages somewhere around 10 or 11 hits out of his 9 to start with. Ignore Cover makes him the equivalent of AP 3, and Lethal Hits just increases his consistency a little bit against high toughness enemies. All of these abilities are great, and he doesn't spend anything to do them, he just gets one. In melee, he can equip a Baleful Sword, a strength 7 AP 2 3 damage melee weapon. I think that's probably in place of the Rod of Sorcery, but given the fact that this guy is mostly a ranged attacker and the Rod of Sorcery profile looks great, you're mostly going to be taking that. The Staff of Tzeentch is his normal melee weapon, attacking 5 times, hitting on 3s at strength 6, AP 1 for 3 damage. Now this profile is already pretty solid. Within 12 to 18 inches, this dude is firing a boatload of ranged attacks, all at high strength, mid AP, mid damage. That makes it difficult to circumvent his attacks because he's not firing single laser beams that you can reroll invulnerable saves against. He's going to be overwhelming the invulnerable saves of most enemy targets. And given the fact that damage reduction is significantly less prevalent this edition, a mass D3 damage range weapon looks incredibly strong. But that's not all. We're not done with this guy yet. Any Tzeentch demon character can equip the Everstave as an enhancement. This one gives +1 to the strength characteristic of the bearer's ranged weapons, so both the Bolt of Change and Staff of Sorcery in this case, and increases their range by 3, pushing them up to 15 and 21 inches respectively. However, if you're within your Shadow of Chaos, so if you control at least half of the objectives in the center of the table and lock in your shadow, or you're just within 6 inches of Be'lakor generically, you double that effect, getting +2 to your strength and +6 to your range. That means his Rod of Sorcery is firing 18 inches at strength 11, and his Bolt of Change is firing 24 inches at strength 12. This moves him from being a pretty solid mid-range, pretty flexible profile to being dedicated anti-tank, wounding most tanks in the game that aren't heavily armored or super heavies on 3s. With a fast movement, relatively survivable body, the ability to benefit from obscuring terrain now, and the newfound monster ability to fire out of melee, the Lord of Change seems incredibly strong. I'm so impressed by this guy's profile. While it is sad he doesn't do mortal wounds from a bunch of psychic powers, not relying on psychic bonuses and having the ability to be denied means that the Lord of Change's damage output is going to be dramatically more consistent than it was. Previously, he could spike a bunch of mortal wounds out if he got very lucky, but that was few and far between. Now he's just going to roll a bunch of 2+s to hit and leave it at that. He could maybe get -1 to hit if he's suffering from his damaged effect, but he has to almost be dead for that to happen, and demons have a reasonable chance to heal at the start of each turn anyway. Now, last but certainly not least, we also got the datasheet for the Bloodthirster. This guy has an incredible top-line profile, a 12-inch move flying monster at toughness 11 with a 4+ base save and a 4+ invulnerable save. That 4+ base save is key because, again, you can benefit from cover on these guys now, so if he's hidden slightly behind a ruin, he can get up to a 3+ armor save against AP0 attacks. He has 18-inch wounds. He has 18 wounds with a leadership value of 6 and OC of 5. This guy's special abilities are pretty solid. He gives Khorne demons +1 to hit with ranged attacks within 6 inches. Kind of boring, but the most important thing it does is actually make him immune to his own damaged ability, since he gets -1 to hit from damage and +1 to hit from his own aura, so he's just going to cancel them out. The only time that would come into play is if your opponent also has a -1 to hit effect, which he ignores normally because he's got a baked-in +1 to hit if he's not damaged. At the end of the fight phase, he can also kick something for a bunch of mortal wounds, and this is actually a dramatic improvement to this effect from the 9th edition Codex. It allows him to pick one enemy within engagement range and roll 8d6. For each 4+ he rolls, he deals a mortal wound to the enemy. Importantly, no cap here, so while he averages 4 mortal wounds, he could kick you for 8 if he is very angry. Now, the weapons are why you're taking Bloodthirsters of Khorne, and they have some good selections. If he is taking a ranged weapon, he can either swing a Blood Flail, a devastating wound, 1 attack, 2+ ballistic scale range weapon at strength 16, AP3 for d6 +1 damage, kinda cute, or a Lash of Khorne, another 12-inch range weapon with 6 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 8, AP0 for 2 damage. Honestly, these are nice to have, but I don't think they really make up for the extended damage that we could see from this guy if he takes a Great Axe. The normal Axe of Khorne actually is a pretty decent trade-off for the Great Axe, however. The standard Axe of Khorne attacks 8 times at strength 14, AP4 for d6 damage, or can sweep to double its attacks at strength 8, AP2, but only 1 damage. However, if he takes the two-handed Great Axe, he loses access to those ranged weapons, but gets a slower but more impressive melee profile, swinging 7 times, hitting on 2s at strength 16, AP4, d6 +2 damage, or 14 times at strength 10, AP2 for 2 damage. Importantly, this guy is basically not going to degrade at all because of the reasons I mentioned before. So while he doesn't have the same level of survivability that 9th edition Bloodthirsters have, he can take a bunch of damage and survive on 1 wound and basically still operate normally, which is a big change from how these guys operated in the past. It got to the point previously where you could have these big Bloodthirsters that were so wounded they could no longer kill what they were engaged with, and their reason to be kind of fell apart. But this new Bloodthirster will just keep slaughtering for as long as he has breath left in his prodigious lungs. But that's not all for this guy, because we also see the return of Argath, the King of Blades, in this detachment. This improves his attacks and strength characteristics of all of his melee weapons. You get +1 attack and +1 strength. However, if again you are within the army's shadow of chaos, benefited from being next to Be'lakor or controlling most of the objectives, you get +2 to your attacks and strength instead. If you are taking the Great Axe of Khorne, that means that on his top profile, he's going to be swinging 9 times at strength 18 for that d6 +2 damage, allowing him to clip out basically most of the big things in the game. That's what Bloodthirsters are supposed to do, and Argath, the King of Blades, will of course be the best one. Now, on top of that, we did get some incredible spoilers for stratagems for this army. The first one being Denizens of the Warp. This one is absolutely crazy, and a pretty good way to use those 3 objective control Plaguebearers. This is used in your movement phase and targets a demon that is arriving from Deep Strike. And it's basically identical to the stratagem we saw from Genestealer Cult earlier. It allows you to set up on the battlefield more than 3 inches away from enemy models rather than the normal 9. However, with the restriction that you can't declare a charge that turn. With units like Flamers in the Codex, this makes the army extremely good at taking your objectives away. You can drop a Flamer unit down, potentially with an attached Exalted Flamer, get all of those bonuses and burn away an enemy light objective control unit. Hopefully, if you can touch their objective, you'll take it yourself, which is good for extending your shadow and completing your secondary objectives. Even if you don't have ranged attacks, you can drop a high OC value unit down and then potentially wait a turn. If your opponent doesn't have the beef to kill you in the shooting phase, you can maybe use a heroic intervention in their turn to charge that unit into melee. Now, one important question that I have that has not yet been answered by the core rulebook of 10th edition is how the timing of these stratagems works. In the previous edition, stratagems always checked the actual phase you were in, so if you treated the timing as a different phase for doing something like Overwatch, you didn't actually pay attention to that. That doesn't look like it's the case any longer in 10th edition, which means you could potentially use this to bring in a unit from rapid egress 3 inches away from your opponent during their turn, making it incredibly difficult to screen out your rapid egress units. And if your opponent doesn't have good lines of sight on whatever is egressing in, you could then be in their back line with a Bloodthirster or something and then absolutely destroy them. That will definitely require clarification when the rulebook is released properly. Now, the other stratagem that we saw is another incredibly powerful one. This is the return of Warp Surge, but it does a very different thing than we've ever seen in the past. This Warp Surge is used on a demon unit in your charge phase that is within your Shadow of Chaos, and it allows the unit within Shadow for 1 CP to declare a charge even if it advanced. Importantly, the timing of this is very good. You use it in the charge phase rather than in the movement phase, so you can advance the unit up, see what they roll to advance, and see what your shooting and your other phases do. If you've made charges on the target already with other units, you can save your CP with this if you don't need to use it. Absolutely insanely strong stratagem, this one, especially with units as high movement as demons tend to be, with move 12 and 14 across the majority of the faction, and the ability to extend their shadow up into the midboard of the table with characters like Bellicor. This is incredibly easy to use and super powerful. So anyway, that is all of the data sheets that we got from the stream game today. Stay tuned for some information about the missions and secondary objectives that we also saw used on stream, and stay tuned for some more spoilers that we get from tomorrow's stream. I actually watch partied this game over on my Twitch channel. We sat in the chat and we talked about the announcements that they were making on stream, and if you want to join me, come hang out over. There's a link down in the video description that you can follow all of my channels on. So with that, let me know down in the comment section what your favorite unit or stratagem that you saw on the table today was. And big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.